Las Vegas, September 7, 1996. Tupac Shakur walked into the MGM Grand to watch Mike Tyson fight, unaware that within hours his own battle for life would begin. The world knows the gunshots on Flamingo Road, but few know the whispers that followed. Was this only a gang feud, or something closer, hidden within death row's walls? That night didn't just end a life, it rewrote hip-hop forever. In this video, we unravel the truth starting from the roots. Before we start, please subscribe. Hours before the bullets lit up the Vegas Strip, Tupac Shakur was living what looked like the pinnacle of his career. Dressed sharply in a black Versace suit, he walked through the MGM Grand with an entourage that reflected his new status as hip-hop royalty. Mike Tyson had just demolished Bruce Seldon in the first round, and the crowd buzzed with energy. Cameras caught Tupac smiling, laughing, his confidence radiating in every gesture. He was only 25, yet already the face of a generation. For fans, Tupac seemed unstoppable. His music was dominating radio, his acting career was opening Hollywood doors, and his public image blended danger with brilliance. But what the cameras didn't see was the storm brewing beneath the surface. Behind that smile was a man pulled in multiple directions, an artist, an activist, and a soldier under constant pressure from the empire he helped elevate. His success wasn't just his own, it was tied to Death Row Records, a label known as much for chaos as for creativity. And while Tupac basked in the spotlight that night, he had no idea that the same company fueling his rise might also be pulling him closer to danger. Death Row Records was more than a label. It was a kingdom ruled with fear, loyalty, and raw power. Suge Knight sat at the throne, controlling artists, money, and perception with an iron grip. Under his leadership, the label had become the epicenter of West Coast dominance, unleashing hits from Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac himself. After bailing Tupac out of prison in 1995, Suge brought him into the Death Row fold, expecting gratitude and loyalty in return. And at first, Tupac delivered. All Eyes on Me shattered records, and his energy electrified the label. But the success came with strings attached. Whispers spread that contracts were designed to keep Tupac tethered, financially bound to death row, even as his ambitions grew larger than any label. Friends later recalled Tupac confiding doubts, even talking about launching Machiavelli Records as his own empire. Inside the camp, loyalty was currency, and any sign of breaking away was dangerous. Death row wasn't a safe haven, it was a pressure cooker. Violence wasn't just on the streets, it pulsed inside the business itself. And for Tupac, the walls of that world were closing in, even as his music reached its greatest heights. When Tyson's fight ended, the MGM Grand turned into a sea of movement. Celebrities, fans, and entourages flooded the lobby, all riding the adrenaline of Tyson's swift victory. Among them, Tupac and Suge Knight spotted Orlando Anderson, a known member of the Southside Crips, leaning near an escalator. What happened next would ignite one of hip-hop's darkest nights. Tupac, surrounded by his crew, lunged at Anderson. Punches flew, bodies crashed to the floor, and security cameras caught every moment. Anderson was beaten badly before guards intervened. To many, that confrontation sealed Tupac's fate. Anderson had motive, connections, and every reason to retaliate. The narrative seemed obvious, a gang conflict spilling into the limelight. But as time passed, doubts began to surface. Why would Tupac, on the biggest night of his public life, personally involve himself in a street-level altercation? Why risk everything? Some argued he was simply impulsive. Others believed he was pressured by those around him to prove loyalty. Either way, the brawl became the spark everyone pointed to after the gunfire erupted later that night. Yet even then, some would whisper that the fight was only a cover, masking deeper tensions that had nothing to do with the Crips at all. The streets of Las Vegas pulsed with neon light as Tupac left the MGM Grand. The air was hot, electric, and filled with the usual chaos that followed him. Fans shouted his name, women screamed, bodyguards cleared paths. He climbed into the black BMW with Suge Knight behind the wheel, his crew trailing in cars close behind. It should have been a night of celebration, a victory lap after Tyson's knockout. Instead, every movement seemed to push him closer to history's breaking point. At 11 p.m., they made their way down the strip, music blaring, windows rolled low. Tupac leaned on the edge of the passenger seat, waving to fans who recognized him instantly. The entourage stopped briefly at a red light, laughing, soaking in the attention. But in the shadows, another car stalked them, a white Cadillac carrying men whose mission was far darker than celebration. At 11:15 p.m., as the BMW paused at an intersection on Flamingo Road, the Cadillac rolled up alongside. The silence of anticipation cracked open with gunfire. 14 shots tore into the air, shattering glass, sparking panic. 4 bullets struck Tupac, one in his chest, one in his thigh, one in his arm, and one grazing his hip. Suge Knight, incredibly, suffered only minor wounds, his head grazed by fragments. The BMW lurched forward, tires screeching as Suge tried to escape. Witnesses scattered, sirens screamed in the distance, but the attackers vanished into the night as quickly as they appeared. Inside the car, Tupac's body convulsed, blood spilling, his voice fighting to hold on. The night had shifted from glamour to nightmare in seconds. By the time emergency responders arrived, Las Vegas was no longer alive with celebration. It was haunted by the sound of bullets that would echo through hip-hop for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, police scrambled for answers. The official story came together quickly, too quickly for some. Investigators pointed fingers at Orlando Anderson, the same man beaten by Tupac just hours earlier in the MGM lobby. To detectives, the motive was clear. The brawl had humiliated Anderson, broadcast on cameras for the world to see. Retaliation fit the narrative perfectly. Within days, headlines branded Anderson the prime suspect. Yet for all the suspicion, no arrest ever came. Witnesses refused to talk. Tupac's entourage, once so loud and visible, turned silent in police questioning. Fear, distrust of law enforcement, and the unwritten code of the streets built a wall of silence that investigators could not break. Still, the inconsistencies were glaring. If Anderson had been the triggerman, why wasn't he brought in? Why were eyewitness accounts conflicting? Some describing shooters who didn't match his build? Why was the white Cadillac never found? The case began to resemble a puzzle with missing pieces, deliberately scattered or hidden. Police claimed lack of cooperation doomed the investigation, but critics argued that apathy and politics played just as big a role. The Las Vegas Police Department was never known for prioritizing crimes involving rappers. To them, it seemed like just another gang shooting. But this wasn't just another case. This was the most famous rapper in the world, gunned down on one of the busiest strips in America. Still, as months passed, leads dried up. Anderson was killed 2 years later in an unrelated shootout, taking whatever truth he carried with him. The official story was left hanging, a narrative without closure, and fans were forced to wonder if the answers were being buried on purpose. For 6 days, Tupac fought to stay alive. He was rushed to University Medical Center, where surgeons worked desperately to repair the damage. Tubes, machines, and constant monitoring became his world as friends and family gathered, praying for a miracle. Outside, the hospital turned into a shrine. Fans sang his songs, reporters swarmed, and every update felt like life or death. His mother, Flamingo Shakur, stood as a pillar of strength, addressing the press with calm dignity even as her son lay unconscious. Those closest to him described moments where it seemed he might recover. Small signs of life, faint words, flickers of resistance that felt true to Tupac's relentless spirit. But the wounds were too deep, the damage too severe. On September 13, 1996, at 4:03 p.m., Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. The announcement spread like wildfire, crossing radio waves, television screens, and newspapers around the world. For millions, the news didn't feel real. Tupac had been larger than life, a figure who seemed invincible, too powerful to be silenced by bullets. Yet here was the truth, cold and final. Vigils erupted across cities, murals began to appear, and an entire generation mourned not just an artist, but a voice that had spoken their anger, their struggles, their dreams. Meanwhile, death row records tried to project strength. Suge Knight appeared in interviews claiming Tupac was destined to survive, insisting he was fine even after his passing. Others in the camp remained tight-lipped, fueling rumors that the truth was being hidden. And within weeks, speculation turned into wildfire conspiracy. How could someone who embodied resilience fall so suddenly? Why did details from the shooting not add up? And most of all, why did it feel as though some people inside Tupac's circle were less surprised than the rest of the world? In the weeks and months after Tupac's death, the world tried to make sense of what had happened on Flamingo Road. The official story from police barely scratched the surface, leaving a void that fans, journalists, and insiders rushed to fill. Out of that silence grew theories, each one darker, stranger, and more compelling than the last. And the strangest part? Every theory seemed to hold just enough truth to keep people believing. The most famous was the idea that Tupac never really died. Almost immediately after September 13th, whispers began, sightings of him in Cuba, blurry photographs in faraway cities, grainy footage of men who looked just enough like him to stir belief. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was fueled by Tupac himself. His final album album released during his lifetime carried the name Machiavelli, the Don Killuminati 7-Day Theory, borrowing from the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli, the philosopher who suggested faking one's own death as a strategy of survival. The album was filled with cryptic references, lines about resurrection, about seeing him again, about watching the world after his passing. Fans latched onto every lyric, every symbol, and every coincidence, convincing themselves Tupac had staged his own disappearance. For those unwilling to accept the loss of a legend, this theory provided comfort, but others turned to more earthly explanations. Some pointed toward the East Coast, reviving the narrative of the coastal feud that had dominated hip-hop headlines for years. Biggie Smalls, his once friend-turned-rival, was still alive at the time, and many speculated that Pac's murder was retaliation for the shooting at Quad Studios in New York 2 years earlier. In that incident, Tupac was ambushed and shot 5 times, an attack he publicly believed was orchestrated by people in Biggie's circle. By 1996, their feud had escalated into all-out lyrical war, each song pouring gasoline on the fire. For those who bought into this theory, the Vegas shooting was the East Coast delivering the final blow. And yet another theory placed the blame on the government. Tupac wasn't just a rapper. He was the son of Flamingo Shakur, a prominent Black Panther who had been surveilled by the FBI. Pac himself was outspoken against systemic oppression, police brutality, and political corruption. His speeches, interviews, and lyrics often blurred the line between art and activism. To those who distrusted authority, it seemed logical that the FBI or other government agencies might have seen him as a threat, a voice too powerful and too revolutionary to be allowed to grow unchecked. Declassified documents have since confirmed that federal agents tracked Tupac during his life, monitoring his concerts and his movements. That fact alone gave fuel to those who believed his death was more than street violence. It was political silencing. But as convincing as those theories sounded, another one was waiting in the shadows, one that cut deeper than distant enemies or shadowy agencies. This theory suggested the betrayal came not from the East Coast, not from the streets, not even from the government, but from within Tupac's own home base, within the very empire he helped to build. Some argued the seeds of his destruction had already been planted. And if that were true, then the tragedy in Vegas wasn't just murder, it was betrayal at the highest level. The so-called death row betrayal theory is one of the most controversial and chilling narratives surrounding Tupac's death. It forces fans to reconsider not just the night in Las Vegas, but everything that led up to it. The core of this theory revolves around Tupac's relationship with Suge Knight and the Death Row Records empire. Suge Knight had bailed Tupac out of prison in 1995, paying over $1 million to secure his release on the promise that Tupac would sign to Death Row. For Suge, it was a business move. Bring in the hottest voice in rap, and the label would dominate the industry. For Tupac, it was a lifeline, but also a chain. The contract tied him tightly to Suge's empire, leaving little room for freedom. In the year that followed, Tupac delivered more than any label could ask for. All Eyes on Me went multi-platinum. His collaborations lit up radio, and his presence gave Death Row its fiercest weapon in the ongoing battle with Bad Boy Records. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Friends and insiders later claimed Tupac was unhappy with the way his finances were handled. Despite selling millions, he often complained of not seeing the money he was owed. Rumors circulated that Death Row controlled not just royalties, but even personal expenses, keeping artists dependent and trapped. Tupac, with his relentless ambition, reportedly started speaking of leaving Death Row altogether. He dreamed of founding his own label, Machiavelli Records, where he would have full creative control and financial independence. For Suge, this was unthinkable. Losing Tupac meant losing the Golden Goose, the artist whose presence kept Death Row at the center of the rap universe. Some witnesses and journalists claimed that Suge had reason to keep Tupac tied to him forever, through loyalty, through fear, or, as the darkest theory suggests, through death. They point to Suge's actions the night of the shooting. He was in the car, yet escaped with only minor injuries despite being closest to the gunfire. They highlight his interviews afterward, where he often spoke ambiguously, almost defiantly, about what had happened. They also point to how quickly Death Row attempted to control Tupac's posthumous releases, turning his unfinished work into albums that continued to generate revenue for the label long after his death. Even more unsettling are claims from former associates, who suggest Suge's empire was rife with betrayal. Some allege that others within Death Row wanted Tupac gone, fearing his independence would weaken their own positions. Journalists investigated investigating the case uncovered whispers that the Vegas shooting wasn't just gang retaliation, but a setup, orchestrated with knowledge from inside the label. Of course, nothing was ever proven. To this day, the betrayal theory remains speculation, but its existence speaks volumes. It reflects the distrust that surrounded death row, the fear that even its own stars were not safe from its grip, and it reframes Tupac's final hours not as the tragic climax of a coast-to-coast feud, but as the silencing of a man who threatened to outgrow the machine that made him. For fans, the idea is almost too painful to believe that the very empire Tupac helped build may have had a hand in tearing him down. Yet the whispers won't fade because too many details from that night still refuse to line up. No matter which theory one chooses to believe, the Crips' revenge, the East Coast rivalry, the government conspiracy, or betrayal from within, one truth is undeniable: Tupac's death changed hip-hop forever. It wasn't just the loss of an artist, it was the loss of a cultural force, a voice that spoke with the urgency of someone who knew his time might be short. The Vegas shooting didn't just kill a man, it reshaped the very DNA of rap. In the immediate aftermath, the East Coast-West Coast feud began to lose its fire. Without Tupac, and with Biggie killed just 6 months later, the war that had fueled record sales and dominated headlines collapsed under the weight of real bloodshed. Record labels became more cautious, fearing that violence could spill further into their business. Artists, too, shifted their tone. Many began moving away from the open threats and aggressive rivalries that had defined the mid-90s, focusing instead on broader themes, safer images, or more commercially viable sounds. Tupac's death served as a grim reminder that words could lead to real consequences, but the effect went beyond business. For fans, Tupac's absence left a void that no one could truly fill. His charisma, his contradictions, his ability to be both poet and provocateur made him unique. Other rappers rose, but none carried quite the same balance of rage and hope, of street credibility and intellectual fire. His albums, re-released and remixed after his passing, kept him alive on the charts, but every song was haunted by the question, what more could he have achieved if he had lived? Over time, his image transformed from artist to myth. Murals, documentaries, and countless tribute songs turned him into a symbol larger than the man himself. For some, he became the eternal rebel, forever fighting against injustice. For others, he was the tragic cautionary tale of how fame, power, and the street could collide with deadly consequences. And for many, he was both, an icon whose contradictions were part of his power. Yet the mystery of his death continues to shape his legacy. Unlike other artists whose lives end with clarity, Tupac's story refuses to close. The unanswered questions, the conflicting theories, the whispers of betrayal, they ensure his narrative never fades. In a sense, Tupac still lives, not in body, but in the debates that keep his memory alive. Every generation of fans finds itself drawn back to that September night, re-examining the evidence, re-arguing the possibilities, re-feeling the loss. And perhaps that is the final irony. Tupac Shakur wanted to be remembered not just as a rapper, but as a revolutionary, a figure who forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. In life, he achieved that through his words, his music, and his defiance. In death, he achieved it again, through the endless questions that refuse to be silenced. His legacy is more than his albums, more than his films, more than his controversies. It is the enduring power of his story, a story that remains unfinished. When the neon faded on the Vegas Strip and the gunfire echoes died, the world lost a man. But hip-hop gained a legend whose shadow still stretches over the culture today. And so, the question lingers, unresolved and eternal. Was Tupac Shakur simply the victim of random violence, or was he undone by forces far closer to home? Until the truth is fully known, his story will remain exactly what it became that night, larger than life, impossible to kill, and forever written into the history of music.